Michael Church, Crawl Space Ninja. We got a great Ask a Ninja from Elaine, and she watched one of our older videos about is crawl space mold dangerous, and I'm going to put a link to that video down below. But she was asking about dead mold. Apparently, she had a contractor come in and look at the mold in her crawl space, and he said it was dead mold, and she was concerned, is that dangerous too? Stay tuned. If you're new to Crawl Space Ninja, we talk about everything related to crawl space encapsulation, waterproofing, indoor air quality. We hope you'll subscribe to our channel, ring that notifications bell, and also follow us on Facebook. If you're a DIYer, check out our DIY store and also our franchise opportunities. Elaine writes, is there such a thing as dead mold? I had mold treated under my house and I went under there with the inspector and I saw what I thought was mold. It sure looked like mold, and he rubbed it and said it was dead mold because it smeared when he rubbed it. Now, Elaine, I've been in many crawl spaces. I've seen many different types of mold, and honestly, I cannot personally tell the difference between dead mold and live mold. Now, what I can tell the difference between is dry mold and wet mold. And according to what I've read on the internet, dry mold means dormant mold, and sometimes dead mold means dormant mold. So just keep this in mind. Dormant does not mean dead. Dormant means it's asleep. In fact, the dictionary describes dormant of an animal having normal physical functions suspended or slowed down for a period of time in or as in a deep sleep. So based on what your inspector was describing, I would say that you have dormant mold, not necessarily dead mold. Just because it's dry and flaky doesn't mean it's dead. Another thing I found online about dormant or dead mold is the internet says that dead mold has a powdery, flaky appearance. To confirm it is dead, brush the surface with a broom. It is most likely dead if it easily brushes off and becomes airborne. So how do you know if it's actually dead? Do you want to brush off the mold and have all these mold spores going everywhere? So in order to confirm whether it's dead or alive, we recommend you take a mold sample and send it off to a microbiologist lab and have them test it to confirm if the mold is dead or alive. Now here's another topic that's of interest. Is dead mold actually dangerous? Okay, so according to the EPA, inhaling or touching mold or mold spores may cause allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. Mold does not have to be alive to cause an allergic reaction. Dead or alive mold can cause allergic reactions in some people. Now, I'm going to put a link to that article down below as well so you can check out what the EPA says. So hopefully you and your inspector, whenever you were down in the crawl space and he was rubbing all that dead mold off of your joist, you all had on a respirator, because technically, according to what the Environmental Protection Agency said, you exposed yourself to an allergen. Okay, so even if you're dealing with mold that you think is dead or alive, you should always make sure you have on proper protective equipment like a respirator, have your eyes covered. Some people are even so sensitive, according to what I've read on WebMD and other websites, that it can affect their skin if they touch the mold, kind of like a person who touches a cat can break out versus someone who inhales cat dander may break out in a different way. So back to my testing recommendation, okay? So in order to determine whether the mold is alive or dead, we recommend you take a sample, send it to a microbiologist lab, but there are different types of testing that mold inspectors will do. There's a viable test and a non-viable test, okay? So a viable test is actually testing if the mold is alive. That's where you take a surface sample with perhaps a sterile swab and you swab a 1-inch section of the wood. You put it back in its little protective casing that has a food source for the mold to live on while it gets transported to the microbiologist lab. And then they grow that mold in a petri dish. Now, if the mold grows, then it's alive, okay? It doesn't matter if it's dry or wet. They can get it to grow if it's alive. Now, they will recommend whether there's too much or too little mold based on what's called colony forming units or CFUs in that sample, and that's up to their interpretation, but they will at least be able to tell you whether that's a mold alive or dead. Now, if you're only concerned about all molds, you would do what's called a non-viable sample. Now, non-viable samples can also be done with a sterile swab sent back to the microbiologist lab. You just choose a different type of testing. You can also do a tape lift on a surface, or you can do an airborne sample. Now, we don't recommend doing airborne samples in a crawl space. Typical protocol for mold inspections would be surface testing in the crawl space. So if you've ever seen someone test the inside of your living space, they got this tripod with this air pump that pumps the air through this cartridge. You send that cartridge off. That type of mold inspection is not recommended in crawl spaces. That is only recommended in living spaces because they actually have to compare the inside mold test to outside. Well, crawl spaces are normally ventilated to the outside anyway, so you can't really do a natural comparison. So what you want to know is the mold that you're seeing on that joist alive or dead? And the only way to do that is with a viable sample. Another question I found interesting on the internet is, does dead mold smell? Okay, so one of the indications of having mold in your house is normally you can't see it at first. Keep in mind that mold spores are microscopic. So the early indicator of a mold problem is actually a musty smell. Some people call it musky. It's not musky. That's like a ferret smells musky. Musty with a T smell is whenever it has that basement-y smell that you notice. You open a closet that you've not opened in a long time and it just kind of hits you. Well, that could be mold spores in that closet. Perhaps if it was near a bathroom and it got damp, and over time it started developing a little mold. So let's again see what the internet says about does mold smell or does dead mold smell. One article I read said humans cannot smell most mold toxins, especially after the mold is dead. Now that was a quote that came from a company website. However, the EPA says some compounds produced molds have strong smells and are volatile and quickly released into the air. These compounds are known as microbial volatile organic compounds, or MVOCs. Okay, so a volatile organic compound is like a gas smell. So you're pumping your gas and you smell gas, that's a VOC, okay? So they call them MVOCs for microbial volatile organic compounds. Because MVOCs often have a strong or unpleasant odor, they can be the source of the moldy or musty smell frequently associated with mold growth. The best way to know how to decipher this information is MVOCs are more pungent when mold is wet and active as described by the EPA. Again, they're not saying the mold is dead if it's dry. They're saying that it's inactive or dormant. So you can still have dry mold and it be alive waiting on that moisture source to come back. And once it does, it's going to be more pungent in smell. It doesn't mean it doesn't smell when it's dry. It just means it's going to be more pungent, kind of like the wet dog thing that I talk about all the time. The dog smells when he's dry or she's dry, but she smells even worse when she's wet, right? That's the same with mold. The mold becomes more active and is releasing VOCs or mycotoxins. Now, mycotoxins give off odors, and some of the reasons why black mold or Stachybotrys is so dangerous is not only are you dealing with the spore of the mold, but you're also dealing with the toxin that it releases. It releases a fume or a VOC in addition to the spore, which is what makes it actually more dangerous than other molds that don't have that MVOC that the EPA is talking about. So Elaine, let's sum this all up. I don't recommend anybody go into a crawl space and start rubbing the joist or writing mold in the joist to scare homeowners. I don't know if you've ever seen that online. People do that all the time. They'll take their finger and write mold because they actually make the mold airborne. And if you and your family are sensitive to the mold, whether it's dead or alive, is irrelevant because they're making it airborne and they're not treating it properly with containment and with soda blasting or scrubbing it off the joist or whatever. So if you're going to deal with mold, whether it's dead or alive, we recommend you soda blast it, completely visibly remove it, apply a disinfectant or a mold cleaner, and apply a protectant to ensure that it doesn't come back, along with controlling dehumidification, waterproofing, and all the things that Crawl Space Ninja does. So I hope that helps you and your family. Hope you make it a happy and blessed day, and we'll see you later.